Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us. BBC has messed up our plans a little bit by folding quite as quickly as they did over the case of Gary Lineker and reinstating him. But we thought there's so many issues that this attempted cancellations throws up that we really want to discuss some of them. There's some obvious issues that come out of it, solidarity is a bloody good idea, and we're much stronger when we're together than the sum of our parts. Even had Ian Wright not refused straight away to appear as a replacement host on Match of the Day, who knows? But this quickly snowballed, and anybody who would have presented that show would have had a lot of criticism coming their way. Some on the left, including on the left, some people, including those on the left, think that this issue didn't really matter to them because Gary Lineker is an extremely rich and massively overpaid member of the establishment culture, which of course he is. But if that shows normal working class people that solidarity is a good thing, I'm all for it. And perhaps it stops somebody crossing a picket line, or even inspires somebody else to join a union or open their mouth when they hear misogyny or chauvinism or racism, etc., etc. This affair also, of course, underlines the poor state of the opposition, the Labour Party. Lineker has shown more guts than the Socialist campaign group has in the last 8 years combined. He refused to apologize, and he was, prompted many times. And if only the Corbyn leadership had done the same over the anti-Semitism smear. So he's got a lot of guts, and that should be, we should hold them in great high esteem for that. Now tonight we want to do it a little bit different. This meeting, and we usually do. And we thought we were having a bit of a discussion with two members of the LLA steering committee, Kevin Bean and Matthew Jones, and want to look at some of the issues that do come up from this cancellation, namely the three big issues we thought we'd be discussing, and then open up for discussion as well from the floor, is the issue of migration, the issue of the media, and the issue of free speech and cancel culture and all of that. And we want to start quickly with the migration issue of immigration and border controls, which is, of course, the reason he was cancelled in the first place, when saying, actually, there aren't that many refugees coming in. That is a controversial thing to say. And of course, he then compared the language to Nazi Germany, which we can discuss as well. But, what policy should socialists advance when it comes to refugees and immigration? Is a policy of open borders the right call? Or does that threaten British workers and their conditions, which is a view that is actually quite widespread on the left and the trade union movement? George Galloway has called for a point system so that our country does not get overwhelmed. Only people coming in who can be usefully exploited. Is that the kind of position we should advance on the left? So we start with this question, and Matthew wants to go first on that.
Okay, thanks, comrades. I think, in terms of migration, we have to start obviously from the situation where we are, that of course we're now, we've been facing a situation of war, essentially almost continuously since 1945. Much worse, obviously, once after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Americans decide that they run the entire place. There's no check on them, and they can bomb anywhere they like. So they do. So now, of course, you've got the destruction. And the reason why, of course, you have this enormous movement of refugees principally is the destruction of large sections of the globe. Whole societies like in Iraq or Syria or Afghanistan have been either extensively or completely destroyed by imperialist wars, and of course they're now running another one in Ukraine, and all of this is generating a huge number of refugees. And the question is, okay, how should they be treated? The thing is, obviously, the attitude of the US and of the EU and the UK, plus of course the more minor imperialist powers like Australia, has been pretty savage You hesitate to call it barbaric because I think it would be a slander on the original barbarians who probably had a greater degree of humanity than these people. And actually, of course, they've treated you basically. They've tried to exclude refugees by the most savage means, basically drowning people in the Mediterranean, shooting at them, etc., etc. In the European case, in Australia case, obviously drowning people, throwing them on small islands, etc. In the US case, leaving them isolated in Mexico and prey to assorted gangs and assorted other, vicious and nasty practices. Now, obviously, this is. It's a facet of the crisis itself, of the degeneration of the system. The fact that the American imperium is breaking down. Obviously, we should stand in solidarity with those people driven to be refugees for whatever reason, whether that's war or, in fact, of course, in the likes of Latin and Central America, climate breakdown, the fact that people can no longer actually grow crops to maintain themselves. So I mean, we have to stand in solidarity with those people and say, we are in favour of their ability to move from places which have been destroyed in various ways and to somewhere they can actually live, because that's going to be necessary increasingly.
Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah, I fully agree with what Matthew said. I do think, though, that there is really another angle to this, and I think it's really looking at the nature of migration. Migration, movements of people, is pretty well a constant in human history. I would think, just looking at the three people on this call, we've all moved a couple of 100 miles, and in the case of our parents and immediate ancestors, we may well have moved even further. And it's a very rare family in this country, even Britain, which is a relatively settled and stable country, that hasn't got some immediate relatives who migrated from other countries and indeed other continents. So my argument about this is that capitalism in particular has intensified migration. The great population movements of the 19th century into North America, movements within Europe, and it continues to be so. So the focus of this particular controversy was on refugees and indeed on asylum seekers. But I do think we need also to be clear that many of the people who want to come to Britain, many of them, coming on those small boats or smuggling themselves in or whatever, are part of that economic migration. And I think to simply focus on the issue of refugees and to turn this into a purely humanitarian issue, in some senses can be quite dangerous for the left, because what it does is particularly to sort of draw attention to, shall we say, genuine refugees, and to point out that, say, somebody from a war zone is a genuine refugee, but somebody from perhaps a neighbouring European country who's, or not that neighbouring, but wants to come and live in Britain to work, to simply get a better life, is in some sense is undeserving. And I think the danger of purely focusing on humanitarian and not looking at the nature of contemporary capitalism and population movement also perhaps takes away from some of the problems associated with migration, particularly that migration's associated with workers coming into a country and reducing wages, being exploited, putting pressure on resources, all the arguments that we hear in relation to these recent cases. So I think as socialists, we have to be in favour of the free movement of labour. We have to support the right of people to live and work wherever they want. But we also have to put forward political alternatives and political programmes that don't allow capitalists either to divide one group of workers from another, but allow migrants, refugees, not to be scapegoated and to be blamed. For example, if if Britain built 1 million houses, then some of the pressures on housing that are often argued are caused by migration would be considerably lessened, if not done away with entirely. As an article in today's Times by Lionel Shriver, a right-wing political commentator, who says that the opposition to migration is justified on the grounds that we've got to look after our own. And if we take that view of looking after our own, of sealing off British workers from other groups of workers, we're playing really into the capitalist hands, because the problems of shortage, and indeed the problems that Matthew alluded to, are caused by capitalism, not just capitalist wars, but by the economic destruction. The so-called Washington Consensus and EU policies in the semi-colonies in Africa, are the product of Western capitalism. And, we shouldn't allow ourselves to be divided along national or ethnic or any other lines. But that policy is one of supporting the right of workers to move. And it isn't solely, I think, based on humanitarian arguments. It's based on class solidarity arguments.
Also, this episode then underlines the need for an international trade union movement, which is really sorely lacking, isn't it? I mean, there's the ETUC, which is run by bureaucrats. There's no international working class organization to speak of. There's various, lash-ups, bureaucratic, semi-Stalinist lash-ups in the European Parliament, etc. But they are entirely useless in challenging war or in challenging, the dumping down of working conditions. Can you imagine, the situation if we had an international organization, in Russia, in Ukraine, in Britain, etc. The situation might be quite different. Why is that so far behind?
Well, but my argument is that much of the organizations of the working class have been set far back. Although I do note that there are some attempts at building solidarity between particular groups of workers in disputes. But I think the strength of reformism generally in the workers' movement, has been an important factor. The fact that the leaders of our movement are not revolutionaries, don't even really have a very good idea of class solidarity. Even in terms of bargaining for labor power, international solidarity would be, make workers much more effective, particularly as now, large parts of European economies, indeed world economies, often have the same employer. We only have to go on holidays or travel into Europe, our nearest neighbors, and we see the same companies, we see the same organizations. So there is a basis for international solidarity, say between transport workers. National Express run trains in Germany. Aviva run, Arriva, I always get those two mixed up. Run buses in the Czech Republic. You have this sort of phenomenon of being aware of the global power of capital, and I think workers have to be, educated, have to be told, have to be explained, and I think that is, we've seen this with the Amazon strikes, and where workers in one continent are learning from others. So I think there is a basis to work there. I've recently been reading some of the resolutions of the Second International in the 1890s and early 1900s. And what's particularly interesting about them is that they do deal a lot with migration, and they particularly deal with the problem of America. Sections of American workers didn't want to, they actually wanted to restrict migration because they argued that it worsened their conditions and their wages. And indeed, they were often politically linked to controls on immigration. And what's interesting is that the arguments against this were not only in the basis of international solidarity, but on the need for organization. And there's quite detailed policy and organizational ideas about how workers should organize themselves, and on the basis they should do that. And it's very clear that this is the first time that the workers' movement is having to look at this phenomenon of mass migration. I mean, I'm sure we've all seen the sort of footage from the time of people arriving at Ellis Island, you know, hundreds of thousands of people, you know, millions of them eventually. And these people will come into America and they will be the basis of the American proletariat. And of course, they will be, you know, they will be people who might start off as not being unionized, as often being used to break strikes. You know, we had that phenomenon in Britain, Irish workers being brought into Scotland or into Northern England to break strikes, who within a generation are recruited and integrated into the British working class and become its most militant fighters. So there are historical lessons for us, and I think we should really pick those up, not only in America but in Britain as well.
Matthew, sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, if you look at that, I mean, that's an interesting point in terms of, you know, migration in America, of course, is that the union movement in the States, the AFL, of course, is one, you know, isolated to crafts, deeply chauvinist and reactionary. Actually, of course, interesting, of course, Gompers, who runs it for decades, of course, is originally affiliate to the First International, but becomes reactionary. And of course, then, you know, it's the IWW, before the First World War, challenges that, and then the CIO in the 30s, you know, the most explosive, you know, movement of the American working class, the CIO in the 30s, and the sit-down movement, and the organization of millions and millions of the unorganized, which is a phenomenal effort, and well studying in those terms. But it's also the whole thing that, you know, I think it's, you know, it's about the deliberate co-option of the union bureaucracy, actually, into basically management of the workforce, which we can see now, you know, any way you look. You know, that of course the union bureaucrats are basically being used, deliberately so, to manage workers. And of course you get the situation which, in the US in particular, of course, the unions are again chauvinist. I mean, you can't see the union in the US or Canada that doesn't come out with anti-Mexican garbage or anti-Chinese garbage or anti-Japanese garbage over decades. You know, but at the same time, you've got a situation where production is integrated internationally. You can't say, you know, oh, such and such is produced in such and such a country anymore, because it's all integrated. Every single form of production is integrated internationally. You know, whether that doesn't matter whether it's you know, a manufactured item or a service or any of that stuff. All of it is basically done across multiple country borders in virtual cases, which actually gives, you know, well, the one thing it does do actually is give transport workers, particularly, you know, truckers, dockers, etc., rail workers, immense power, which is why the been effort to try and break, you know, the organization of these groups of workers, because they can stop everything, you know, because, you know, if the transport that makes all this function stops, then everything else stops. And this is the question, but it goes into, you know, then of course, so obviously you as you say also about, you know, the economic destruction of large chunks of the world. So you wind up with situations, say, where the deliberate destruction of industry in the old Stalinist countries actually means that they can then basically a lot of the workforce of say truck driving is done by likes of, you know, Bulgarians and Romanians and Poles and so on and so forth, who are then treated appallingly badly. You know, and this is the problem that they then had after Brexit, because they couldn't get these guys anymore. You know, these guys are holding everything up. You know, so in those terms, it's and being a, you know, this sort of anti-migrant stuff is actually counter to the interests of the sort of the way the system works, actually, but it's a method of control by the ruling class.
Yeah, there's also another.
Go on, Kevin.
Sorry, there was also another point that occurred to me there as you were speaking, Matthew, when you were talking about the impact of Brexit, because one of the points about migration is that the recent figures actually show that migration is running at fairly high levels, and that much of that migration comes from outside of the European Union. So that, again, I'm talking about the sort of dynamics of capitalism that you're describing, mean that the ruling class needs workers, needs particular types of workers, and it will get them from wherever it wants. So you know, we're now bringing in workers into Britain from you know, as far away as the Philippines, Indonesia, Nepal, as well as in countries like you know, Azerbaijan, Tajikistan, and so on. So the sort of illusions of you know, the idea that capitalism can be separated out on national boundaries, you know, I think have been proven by that. And so the debate is actually who sets the conditions of control of entry. You know, it's who's going to bargain over this labor power. And if we accept arguments about limiting migration, we're essentially handing that over, or confirming that in the hands of the employers and the capitalist class.
Yeah.
And we're sorry for butting in.
No, quite right.
No, but the thing is, the problem being, you see, is that it's then this contradiction between what's required to make the system work. And I mean, it's quite extraordinary, you know, in terms of if you look at the skilled workers. My mother, when she was sort of on the point of retiring, did VSO training medical students in Addis Ababa, or just in Gondar, just north of Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. And she said she'd never seen a lot of students work so hard in all her days, because they knew that was their ticket out of the place. It meant that they could work almost anywhere, and most of the time it meant they could leave Ethiopia. You know, so you can see this sort of global point. You know, the global point.
I think it also throws up an interesting issue, which is that capitalism in Britain wants migration. They need migration.
Needs it.
But the government, as we see the government as the representative of capital, they have different pressures going on. They have the pressure of seemingly wanting to keep it down, etc. That must create quite difficult.
But
Do you think they're actually interested in enforcing these new laws, or is it sort of more like a curtain, to a smoke screen that it's actually not going to be implemented much because migration is required?
But it's a mechanism of control, you see. I mean, the thing is, they need to do two things. I mean, one, they need to split the working class, which is why capitalism has used racism, sexism, all these other methods, in order to split the working class. It's necessary. I mean, the capitalist class is a small minority. It has to use these methods. Now, you could posit a capitalism which isn't racist, but they can't make it work. So it doesn't exist. I mean, capitalism is racist. It is sexist because it needs to do these things in order to maintain control. And it's that then, of course, what we're getting into this is contradiction between the need to maintain control and the need to make the system function. So that that's where that is.
Well, I think there are clearly sort of political pressures on the Tories, and that probably explains some of this sort of controversy over Gary Lineker, and maybe the culture war aspects. I mean, there's probably an argument that the legislation and indeed the whole politics of this are designed to appeal to sections of voters who the Tories think will be persuaded that cracking down on migration and so on is the way to sort of deal with problems and solve the crisis and so on. So there's clearly a political interest in that. I think economically there are also sort of different pressures, so that you can see that certain sections of the capitalist class favour certain types of migration, others less so. So I think we would need to look at those particular interests. I mean, for example, sections of agricultural capital want particular types of workers. The specialist work in IT and elsewhere requires another type of work, and so it's sort of fits into that framework. But what I think is important is to talk about the globalized nature of the economy, and why I talked about the various, the new figures that come in, is that it shows, in a sense, limiting migration is a pretty sort of utopian policy in purely capitalist terms. Now, politically, it makes sense, and I mean, the Tories in particular have got a long historical tradition of chauvinism and of anti-immigrant, politics. Just in the last 150 years or so, they introduced, anti-migrant legislation, blame migrants for everything from diseases through to the physical degeneration of the British race, and so on in the early 20th century. So, there's a long political tradition of that. And indeed, because of my age, I remember when anti-migrant sentiment was, stock in trade for Tory politicians. I do remember Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech. I do remember.
Well, it's also because the infamous Smethwick by-election, if you want in for a Labour vote
Well,
Labour.
I was going to come to that, Matthew. I'm just a little bit too young for that, but I do remember the controversy, a few years later. But, certainly, in the 60s and 70s, Margaret Thatcher used the language of swamping and talked about, that people would feel that, native people would feel they were being swamped by these immigrants. So I think that, when we have the sort of Tories, pretending, to be disdainful of this sort of politics, it's part of their politics. But I think there's also another point. Sorry, I won't go on for too long, and that is that there is a type of what we might think of as state multiculturalism. There is a type of state policy which says that racism is wrong, and I think in a sense Gary Lineker reflects some of that type of policy. So the nature of the cabinet, its ethnic composition, shows that there isn't a simple equation between the Tories and racism, between capitalism and racism. And indeed, the sort of official multiculturalism, which talks about, that we've gone beyond this, we're in a new sort of more tolerant Britain, is also an important ideology that identifies capitalism actually with anti-racism and with breaking down boundaries. It's a bit like the identification of capitalism and democracy, again, that capitalism is a liberalizing system. And I think that that's also an important part of this debate. We have to be aware of this and not just simply think of the old Tories or the Tory traditions. There's another one which is equally bogus and equally dangerous, but we have to be aware that it exists.
Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah.
Probably, I mean, this isn't kind of a different, additional discussion, but it's not an unimportant one in that, yes, the state has changed. I mean, the capitalism arose with racism, wasn't it? It was quite important to use slaves to justify using slaves in building up capitalism, etc. But has something changed in the last decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, perhaps? And obviously Kevin says yes, but Matthew, you think it's still the same level of racism going on in society as before?
Obviously, the use of, the extraordinary thing is, of course, you now get politicians like Braverman and Sunak, of course, who are, implementing policies which would have meant their own parents being excluded in some cases. Something actually that happened, first of all, with Howard, if you remember, because of his parents, of course, were refugees from Romania. So yeah, it's quite extraordinary in those terms. But I mean, if you look at the actual function of the state, it's still racist. I mean, profoundly so. The function of things like the Home Office is just is absolutely profoundly racist. Everything they do. If you look at, the worst of the lot, of course, is the US. I mean, the US is just incredibly racist. in terms of the oppression, the depression of black people and then the coloured people, people of colour, as they say, in the States is just phenomenal, and it's written into the system, which is why, of course, that part of this, the thing is obviously in terms of the Tories, is the Tory connection, particularly to the Republican Party, and the Republican Party, of course, is now trying to say, well, no, you can't even discuss the fact that the state is racist. You can't do this. We're again, what is it? The critical race theory. It must be stamped out, which is essentially to say, well, you can't discuss, the fact that the state is racist and has been for 2 centuries. And how it's racist. And the thing is, obviously, the other side to that, of course, was the policy of, again, you go back to Richard Nixon, who was actually the most cunning character in terms of the Republican Party, who, first of all, of course, came up with this Southern strategy to replace the Democrats in the South, in the old South. Because, I mean, the KKK was essentially the armed wing of the Democrat Party in reality. Which is also come back to haunt them recently in Florida. So he did that. So okay, we'll replace the Democrats as racist in the old South, which they've done very successfully. At the same time, he said, well, we shall raise a section, because obviously you then had an insurgent black working class, willing to take, say something like the Great Detroit Riot. Actually, they lost control for like 10, 11 days. They were absolutely terrified. And that has happened elsewhere as well. I mean, sort of you can see that in the Rodney King riots and all these things going back over a whole period. And then, of course, this massive movement into 2020 around George Floyd and many other people, Breonna Taylor. But the point was to raise up a section of that part of the population, people of color, as they say, who were then co-opted into the system. So you now, of course, have black billionaires like Oprah Winfrey or Jay-Z or all these people, and they're thoroughly integrated into the system, and they're actually part of the defense of the system. And the question is, okay, well, how does that function? That the bulk of people are still subject to this gross oppression, and yet a tiny fraction have been co-opted into the operation and defence of the system by a deliberate policy, particularly obviously in the US, which of course is the hegemon and therefore sets the line for everywhere else. So that, I mean, in those terms, you have to look at it in those in that kind of analysis.
You can have, of course, racism in society while the ideology of the ruling class somewhat changes. I mean, I don't think Kevin saying there is no racism anymore. But shall we move on from the subject? Sorry?
It's a dual thing, where you have, as I say, a certain privileged minority are allowed, as it were, and co-opted, and everybody else is still subject to the same thing. You're still in a desperate situation where, now you have a position essentially where the cops in the States are essentially encouraged to kill people. They kill 3 people a day. And of course, being racist, they kill more people of colour than they do. But not in as people pointed out, probably roughly the same numbers as white people, but of course there are fewer people of color, therefore the rate of killing is higher. But that and many other things are still oppress that section of the population. So I mean, in those terms, I mean, as I say, you can cut one part and still oppress everybody else.
This sort of leads to a related issue, which is we wanted to discuss, which is the issue of free speech, where you have ruling class ideology and then the reality of it. I think the ruling class ideology has been we want free speech, and we must enforce free speech in universities, and we must enforce it through law, and you shall go to prison if you don't ensure free speech. And that all sounds very good. Sounds like something we should sign up to because we're in favor of free speech. And then you look at the reality of it, of course, and it means free speech for them. It means free speech for the ruling class. It means free speech to keep the status quo. If you challenge it, of course, then, you know, you shall be cancelled, although we're officially, of course, against cancel culture, unless you criticize the status quo, as in Gary Lineker's case. I mean, that was quite beautiful. If you as I have to do for work, read the Daily Mail on a daily basis, campaign for solid 2-3 weeks by the Daily Mail on the front page, you know, cancel Gary Lineker, and, you know, and then inside another thing, oh, we're against cancel culture if it's against the left, and, you know, trans activists, etc. They should be, that's a problem if they're canceling our people, but we're all in favor of canceling Gary Lineker. And that issue of free speech is another interesting one for the left as well, because it does raise the issue of free speech for everybody. Should it be unrestricted, or, you know, should there be restrictions on some people, like, you know, racists, fascists, etc., which always for me begs the question of who decides what a racist is, what a fascist is. I mean, you know, in the Labour Party, we were called racists. We were the racists for criticizing Israel. That made us allegedly anti-Semitic and racists. You know, so I think that is a problem. I'm going to start with Kevin on that one. What's your view on that issue?
Yeah, I think you've pointed out the hypocrisy very well, Tina. My commiserations about your dreadful working conditions that force you to read the Daily Mail. I really think you ought to do something about that. That's, in the American terms, cruel and unusual punishment. But joking aside, I do think that the sort of culture war arguments and the arguments about cancel culture have been used against the left, and it has become, I think, quite an important political theme. I said that I thought that much of what was being done now by the Tories was really part of their election campaign, and particularly, I suppose that they set up this idea that there is something called a woke elite, liberal elite, metropolitan liberals who sort of dominate society and are imposing all sorts of weird and wonderful ideas on ordinary, decent, commonsensical people. So that's part of that sort of political, you know, narrative that the Tories and the Daily Mail have put forward. I think on the broader issue though about free speech, I think the danger that you've posed with it is, of course, the question of who defines it. And I stand for complete freedom of speech and freedom of political expression, which is a left and a Marxist political tradition going back into the 19th century. So what I'm not going to get involved with is to sort of draw up lists of people who can and can't speak. And in particular, draw up sort of bans and prescriptions on which ideas cannot or can and cannot be expressed, partly because those weapons will be used against the left, and indeed they usually are, but also because we're again handing power to the capitalist state to you know, arbitrate on all sorts of ideas of thought. And this is particularly, I think, the case with the BBC. You know, the much quoted examples of that when Gary Lineker was making, you know, the standard sort of liberal remarks about Jeremy Corbyn, you know, get rid of him, or was making, you know, other snide references that were, you know, deemed acceptable, then this wasn't political. And the same goes for a whole host of people connected with the BBC. I mean, again, we've heard about that this week, you know, that Lord Sugar is able to make comments. Lord Sugar, I think, was on the front page of The Sun with a mock-up of Jeremy Corbyn as Adolf Hitler, you know, calling upon people not to vote Labour. So that is pretty well, you know, a political intervention. I think the Lineker case, though, was a good example of the selective nature of it. But it's also part of other battles involving the BBC, from issues as mundane as the license fee, you know, the desire of papers like the Mail and Murdoch papers to break the BBC up so that they can get their own media operations in there. So there are all sorts of, quite pecuniary motives operating. But I think there's also a very much a division in elements of the state and what we might think of as the ideological state apparatus, without using too much jargon, that within the BBC and within parts of the media, there are different views reflecting different sections of the ruling class. And I think that the divisions in the BBC reflect that. I mean, one of the very interesting things about this recent spat has been that not only have the BBC sort of withdrawn, retreated, but also I sense that many sections of the ruling class didn't want to go down that road. In other words, that they were not as strongly behind the Tories, and some of the Tories rather miscalculated, which again perhaps indicates that wider political crisis that Matthew was referring to earlier. But if we are going to sort of talk about the principle of this, then I am in favour of unrestricted freedom of political expression. And, this clearly fits into that. Gary Lineker is no sort of, great martyr in that sense. But the fact that people were attempting to stop him and from where they were coming from is, I think, important. And it points up, the hypocrisy of many capitalist institutions, capitalist media, who will, claim to stand for freedom in one area, but then restricted in others. We have to be for universal freedoms in that sense, because they benefit the working class. It's inscribed on the banner of the working class and has been, from the days of the French Revolution.
I think Matthew might have a slightly different view.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's various things to say in terms of those terms. Is it? I mean, first of all, obviously, the ruling class capitalism is not democratic by its nature. I mean, a class which is a small minority and exists by expropriating the product of the bulk of the population really has struggles with democracy. I mean, into any real, it's conceded democracy. It had to be wrung out of it, and it then tends to does use it as a sort of deflector and usually runs about boasting about democracy of one kind or another. But of course, it isn't. It really isn't. And the thing is now, when we see the level of the current crisis, I mean, increasingly becomes dictatorial. We can look at this and you can say, okay, well, we can look at this and say, well, in contrast to notions of the dictatorship of the proletariat, this is the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Actually, it decides, what is permissible and acceptable, etc. So obviously, there are disputes within it, And the thing is, as I say, the point to watch in the current situation is the linkage between the repugs, the Republicans in the US, and the Tories, because the Tories essentially wholesale are importing their political line a few years behindhand from the Republicans in the US, and it's moved towards Trump and the populism and so on and so forth. I mean, obviously, this creates real problems in those terms because the society here is quite different, and clearly also what comes out from Lineker and of course from Corbyn in particular, of course, is that the ruling class itself is now really attempting to hold the line in terms of what is permissible to politics, i.e. politics cannot vary outside of a given set of essentially neoliberal ideas that essentially that most of the population will see a diminishing living standard, will squeeze down on their public services, their wages, etc., etc., etc. And all politicians who essentially are permissible within the system or draw the line from their lords and masters will will toe the line on that question. And the Corbyn was absolutely, that was clearly the point, which of course he missed completely. As a reformist, he couldn't see it. But I mean, what he could see obviously was the fact that the enormous pressure on him as somebody who essentially sort of said, well, you know, maybe there is something different, you know, even if it's sort of unformed and reformist, or you know, something isn't actually neoliberal and may concede certain things to the working class, which of course the ruling class was unprepared to concede, to be discussed even, never mind done. I mean, the point was, if you look at, say, you know, the example of Syriza in Greece, I mean, Syriza took a few months to capitulate. Corbyn would have taken hours if he'd got in. If he'd have succeeded in 2017, he'd been squashed. You know, probably wouldn't have even made it through the doors of number 10. They wouldn't have let him in. But the point being also, you see, I think in those terms, therefore you're looking at, you know, that this also is the squeeze on in terms of freedom of speech, and we can see this in terms of the likes of the political evolution BBC, which has never varied from being a mouthpiece strictly controlled by the state. You know, it's not varied from that at all. But what's allowed has been squashed quite drastically. You know, to the point where you even have like David Attenborough, who's about, you know, about as establishment as they get, really. You know, I mean, the man actually set up chunks of the BBC. The BBC Two was actually founded by David Attenborough. You know, he's about as institutional as they get. But one of his programs, which challenges the notion that actually they're destroying large chunks of the environment, they weren't broadcast. You know, it's extraordinary stuff. So there's that. In terms of freedom, you know, whatever. I mean, obviously we want a free debate. The only difference is we have to exclude fascists. We can't allow fascists. I mean, this is the point. The reason for fascism is in order to destroy the left and the Labour movement. It has no other purpose, and therefore we won't allow these people to either speak or wander about the place. We can't do that. I mean, just to danger to ourselves and to the working class, etc. You know, it's fairly basic. I mean, tomorrow there will be a demonstration outside, you know, the further series of demonstration outside a hotel outside of Erskine in Renfrewshire, just down the road here, where we're attempting to stop a bunch of fascists from having a go at the refugees in the hotel, which has been going on for the last 6-7 weeks. So in those terms, I mean, it's continual. In this town in Glasgow, we just don't allow fascists to wander about the place. We won't, and quite rightly so. You know, they just can't run a demonstration here. Okay, there are other questions like the orange question also, but in terms of naked fascists, no. You know, so in those terms, I mean, that's the exception, because that's just dangerous. I mean, there's no question of it. And you look at the history of it, that's just the issue. So it's then to say, well, okay, you know, that it's how to break away from, you know, to understand why that's going on and how to break it. The problem being, as you say, the thing is the issue that's been portrayed both by Corbyn and Lineker, of course, is that most of the population doesn't agree with what's being done, and is to the left of what's being offered. I mean, you know, why is it we've got a lot of politicians who are basically, you know, scumbags, you know, who are offering nothing.
Let me put this point about free speech then to Kevin, because it's an interesting point where there are divisions on the left. So you don't allow fascists to march. I mean, leaving aside the issue of who defines what a fascist is, you know, we can sort of guess hard figures, you know, neo-Nazis. But then, okay, get back to Kevin. I mean, does that bear the danger of making them into martyrs?
Well, I think it makes a number of mistakes, and particularly, you know, about the seriousness of the fascist threat. I don't want to, you know, perhaps go into a wider discussion on the nature of fascism, but it's clear that fascism arises as a mass movement and as a threat to the working class, you know, in both revolutionary, pre-revolutionary periods, certainly in periods of crisis, and it's used as a weapon by the ruling class to smash the organized working class. So fascism on the scale that we might have seen in interwar Europe, or even on the scale, for example, that I would remember in the 1970s, does not exist at the moment, certainly in this country. It's probably stronger as a force in certain parts of Europe, but even then I don't think it constitutes the same threat, if only because the working class doesn't constitute the same threat to the capitalist class. So the relationship between fascism and capitalism is different. I'm not arguing, for example, Matthew, that groups of refugees or indeed areas of cities where migrants live or indeed the organizations of the labor movement shouldn't be defended. I'm not arguing for some sort of Gandhian pacifism. I'm certainly in favor of defense of democratic rights. And that, does mean protection, both of physical space and the protection of the right of freedom of expression for the working class movement. But I think that not only is the question of definition a difficulty, but I think that the first line that we should certainly take in this period is one of a political alternative to the politics of the far right, and that simply to pose the question in terms of physical attack, because that's essentially what I think the argument is about. I'm not opposed to, for example, counter demonstrations, but the issue of physical attack in this period, which I think is the implication of no platform for fascists, I think is one that can't be carried out, and indeed I don't think is necessary. Defense is necessary, and putting forward a political alternative, and that I think is the important point, undercutting the basis of far right politics. For example, in Liverpool, or rather Merseyside, where we had an attack on a migrant hostel, I was present with a group of people who were demonstrating in support of the refugees and the migrants, and it was very clear that the crowd of people that was protesting was primarily people who had all sorts of prejudiced and confused ideas. The far right were a very small grouping. Now, they were very well organized, and they were far better organized than the anti-fascist groupings were. And but perhaps more importantly, older comrades from that area would remember when, if there was going to be a protest, it would be a working class protest. It was an area where there was a history of working class struggle, where there were rent strikes, factory occupations, and it's been the decline of capitalism in that area, but above all, the failure of the labor movement to organize and to pose any sort of political alternative. So I think that should be our first point, not simply focusing on a group of people called the fascists. Many of the people who are around the far right are confused. They're looking for answers, and I think that is the politics of it. But it's certainly what I'm not advocating either in the 1920s when I wasn't around, or indeed in the 1970s when I was. I'm not arguing for some sort of Gandhian principles here. I'm in favor of rigorous defense of freedom of speech, and we're not yet in the conditions of sort of internal civil war, which is what essentially Germany and Italy was facing. And I think we have to look at it politically in that way. Now, I know that position is probably not a popular one, and it's probably one that people will argue for no platforming, and they will mean physical attacks on the far right. And my argument is we have to begin initially politically. And, yeah.
I'm going to give an example as well, because we had that recently in a webinar where somebody came along and started shouting abuse. I think we are anti-Semites, etc., and describe themselves as a Zionist. So brought them into the webinar, and then say, what do you think makes us anti-Semites? Can you define what anti-Semitism is? Blah, 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 blah. totally like a balloon that the air was left out, had nothing to say. I mean, that was an easy example, but I think sometimes it can, and it's not always the case, but sometimes it can actually work quite well, debating with people who have stupid ideas like that, rather than saying, well, you know, we shut you up. And as somebody says in the comments, that actually makes them more appealing, perhaps, you know, ooh, you know, they must be special because not even them commies are, you know, they don't dare talking to them. Bring them in. I'm not saying it's always a rule, but it can perhaps work. Bring them in, show them up for the stupidity that they're coming out with. And perhaps some of their supporters are convinced, as Kevin said, you know, these are often confused people who are looking for answers, working class people who are looking for answers at the wrong place. We show that we have better arguments. Would that not be perhaps a better way, Matthew, sometimes to deal with those so-called forces, especially when they're not a real threat, and they're not a real threat in the sense at the moment, as Kevin explained. I think there isn't a fascist movement that is, you know, threatening our livelihoods as working class people.
I think the thing is, I mean, obviously, I did know people who were present at the point at which the National Front in the 70s were broken, the Battle of Lewisham, in which the left and the local youth said, "You're not coming through here. You just ain't coming through our area." You know, because I mean, obviously, Lewisham was heavily black and Asian area, so they weren't having them, and they stopped them. And that was the point. That's the point. Is the fascists want this thing to march around, you know, and intimidate people and all the rest of it. And they just sort of, we're not having it. No, it's not happening. And that actually was the key point at which the National Front was broken, as that kind of street movement. In terms of what's happening now, I mean, I can, you know, I can certainly, I mean, obviously Knowsley was extremely difficult. I don't know without being on the ground, but looking at the pictures, it looked really quite hairy and difficult in terms of the numbers of people present and so on, and the sort of amount of violence that was employed. You know, that really on the back foot. At least, I mean, you know, in Erskine, actually, the protest the counter protest is always bigger than the other lot. And the thing is, obviously, then people have taken precisely that attitude, that there are two lots of people there who are, you know, more or less, that you're trying to deal with. One is fascists. I mean, there are actually organised fascists. Now, there's a quite different lot of people. The other one is local folk, you know, who are pissed off and have, you know, various questions and issues. And the thing is, the point has been, people have said, right, okay, we want to get rid of the fascists. We want to talk to the people who've turned up because they're pissed off about whatever. Now, you know, so it's actually taken that sort of thing. You know, how do we isolate fascists and get rid of them and talk to everybody else? And the thing is, obviously, it's then been done. I mean, it's not a question. It's also that of course, much of the activity has been conducted by people who live locally and so on. Okay, there's some Glasgow who've been there to support and the rest of it, but it's then been a debate in terms of. But obviously, under conditions in which clearly, you know, what you're seeing is things are being made worse. I mean, clearly what you've got is a situation where, you know, the ruling class and its political operatives, whether that's the Tories, the Labour Party, or the SNP, actually want to make things worse year on year. And so you've seen, you know, obviously the pressure on real wages, and then of course allied with the huge cuts in public services. I mean, you know, the cuts forced through by Holyrood last November are on the scale that, you know, the same as, if not, we actually put through a few weeks before the Tories even announced what they were doing, and that, you know, there's been huge cuts in all of the councils and public services generally in Scotland. So I mean, that's getting worse is the problem, and it's a question. Okay, well, you know, how is it you're actually going to combat that? You know, under conditions in which, I mean, it's very, you know, without the problem being, of course, I mean, what we're ultimately facing, and this goes back to what was been said before, of course, is that there's a political state, an organisational state of the workers' movement. You know, coming out of the situation in which, you know, we had control by the Stalinists over, you know, decades. That's now basically disintegrated, and now we've got a situation in which we've got control basically by forces who are essentially on the other side politically. And the question is, okay, well, how does that evolve? How can the left put forward something that actually can deliver because I mean, ultimately, you know, the political forces you're seeing, the reason why we're seeing all this stuff, as I say, is because actually, in material terms, all of these people are basically saying things are just going to get worse. You know, so we need to distract with racism or all this other stuff, you know, or call it, you know, describing, you know, various people as this, that, and the other, and the rest of it, and all this sort of culture war stuff. It's a distraction from the fact that actually they're just making life worse for people.
There will be people coming in. Tony has already got his hand up and he's got a very strong view on that. But I did want to have one final issue that to discuss, and we don't need to spend long on this. And I'm sure you probably both agree, is the question of how do we deal with this kind of media bias that's been, you know, really, I mean, everybody jumped on the anti-Gary Lineker bandwagon with a couple of exceptions, but you know, you have the whole media establishment is going one way, which is the support the ruling class ideology, more or less, support the Tory government, more or less. Do we need, for example, on the BBC, do we need stronger rules? Do we need more codes of conduct? Do we need proper impartiality? You know, should Fiona Bruce be cancelled as well? Should the right wingers be cancelled? Is that the answer? Or Kevin, does the answer lie maybe somewhere different? I'm hoping you'll come up with something different now.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm all in favour of rules and regulations, Tina. No, I think I think we have to understand the nature of the media as you know, as a weapon and as a means for the ruling class to spread its ideology, and you know, it's the role, particularly of the BBC, you know, in the way that Matthew's described it, of naturalizing, normalizing, you know, capitalist ideology, and particularly the idea of impartiality, which is, you know, pretty spurious, you know, at the best of times. I think short of you know, a fundamental revolutionary change, you know, taking the means of production out of the hands of the capitalist class, then those institutions will continue to act in that way. I think our immediate aim should be for the you know, the expansion of the workers' media and the development of our own media and our own means of expression. You know, we need to expose, you know, what the BBC does, what the papers do, but we also need to establish our own voices, and those at the moment are, you know, particularly weak. You know, the papers of the left, you know, there are several of them, but they're quite small circulations. You know, we do run media channels and so on, but when you consider the size of the trade union and the labour movement, it should have a much stronger media. And that, I think, is an important point that comes out of this, that we shouldn't get drawn into games about who can and can't speak on the BBC. We should, you know, reveal what it actually is, and, you know, put forward demands for you know, a different type of media. But that really is linked, I think, to the wider transformation of society. So our immediate task, I think, is to build our own media, and you know, and to counter those sorts of ideas in that way. Anyway, that's, you know, that would be my initial response.
I did ask Jeremy Corbyn at a meeting of the Labour Representation Committee what things he regrets after he's been outed, and actually that's the thing he came up with, which is an important issue. I mean, I was hoping for the anti-Semitism smear campaign. Media is pretty good one as well. He said he regrets that he didn't make use of the millions of pounds flooding into Labour Party coffers to actually set up media channels, newspapers, etc., which he could have done, and that would have put the left in a much better position to put forward its, you know, Corbyn's point of view and not rely on the bourgeois media to take us apart. Matthew, do you have a different view on that matter? Or
I think there's two things. I mean, I was present at a miners' rally in Mansfield in April 1984, at which Arthur Scargill appeared like this, appealing for the crowd to quiet so he could speak. And of course, the Murdoch press chopped off one arm and pretended he was Hitler. And the printers, the Fleet Street printers, no, that isn't going out. We're not printing that. That is not happening, you know, because it's a fabrication, obviously, you know, and you're a bunch of rotten swine. And that's the point, is first of all to say, well, you know, the working class through its own power and its own organizations of trade unions should be saying, you know, this is what we want, you know, and when some things, you know, like in terms of the BBC is extensively unionized. The unions said almost nothing about the whole thing. You know, well, what do you know, you guys work in the damn BBC. What do you want from it? You know, what should go out? You know, the likes of Beck, of course, said a little bit saying, well, it's not very nice, is it? You know, and the NUJ, of course, is just hopeless. But I mean, you know, it should be a question for the unions. The other thing, of course, is that actually, of course, all this comes out of it. You know, the question of organising a proper political current of the left. You know, that the left needs to organise itself and generate that, you know, as its own media activity. You know, clearly as a key point. So, you know, point out what the world really is. You know, rather than the fictions that were being offered, and the sort of, you know, really anti-social crap that the ruling class is using at the moment.
And it has to be interesting media, of course. I'm a member of the Lineker in Germany, and they did try their hand once off on launching a national newspaper, and it was embarrassing. I mean, it was, you know, the government is very bad, and, you know, we're trying to be very good, and that kind of rubbish. I mean, that's, you know, dumping down. They try to emulate the Bild newspaper, the sort of tabloid, German big tabloid, which is not what we should be aiming for, not treating the working class like kids, but actually, you know, elevating them. Anyway, let's open up for discussion. That went on a bit longer than we had planned, but I thought it was very, very interesting, touching on quite a range of issues. Joanne had her hand up first. Hello, comrade. You need to unmute yourself.
Unmute, that's it. Hear me?
Yep, we can. Hello.
Right, let's see if I can follow my notes here. We started on the migrant issue, did we not? I live on a Scottish island, and for a number of years I was involved as an organizer with the Scottish Socialist Party, but the branch kind of collapsed when the SSP, Scottish Socialist Party, split, and so these days I'm more of I follow a lot of, I've done a lot of reading more reading of Marxist theory, so I probably regard myself as having quite a high theoretical layer, theoretical level in that sense, but I don't get much chance for real world activism. The only activism I tend to do is online. But I think that there's a massive change that took place, as I see it, when the Cameron government decided to to work out the battle that was going on between the two wings of the Tory party, between primarily the left of the Tory party on the one hand and the ERG on the other. And when the referendum campaign got underway, I decided that I would start from basics to make a decision regarding how I should personally take this up. And I imagine being on the streets, as I've been many times in the town, in the main town here, with you know, petitions out and posters and so forth, engaging with the public. And what stood out to me in the entire campaign was the focus on immigration, the amount of coverage provided to the to UKIP, and I was in a sense I was kind of shocked by this, and I thought, if I was to campaign on the streets on the question of how people should vote in the referendum, I would have to primarily attack the the way in which racism appeared to be on the rise and was common parlance. And I took a position of saying, I mean, yeah, when the first referendum was held, I have to say I was a member of the militant at the time. And I agreed with the slogan that was put out by the militant of no to the EU but yes to a socialist Europe. I thought that was the correct approach. But there was none of that in the latest referendum. And I was really disappointed in debates I had with left-wingers online. What seems to be happening in my mind was what I would describe as a browning of the red. There was a massive amount of tailism going on, because what the arguments that were being put out is that apart from the fact that they were saying that attacking the EU as a neoliberal institution, they were also taking the lead, not from theory, but from yeah, okay, I'll try and wrap up. Not from theory, but from a tailism. They were saying, well, this is what the working class think, and it wasn't what the working class were thinking. It was what some sections of the working class were thinking, and those sections, the working class that were thinking that way, were doing this on the basis of anti-immigration, xenophobia, and ultimately racism. So I think one of the things that's so important to me is in all of this is to for the left to improve its theoretical level, so that we don't fall into those particular traps. We don't allow browning of the red, and we don't allow the use of tailism rather than, you know, a Marxist and a dialectical analysis of events.
Absolutely. Thank you, Joanne. Tony was gagging all the way through to come in on fascism.
Thank you, Gina. Yes, this is an important debate and one we need to have. But I have to say, free speech is a weapon in the hands of the working class, just like free speech is a weapon in the hands of the ruling class, and they mean very different things to each of them. Kevin presents what is really the classical bourgeois liberal approach of John Stuart Mill and other similar thinkers. And really, Kevin, I hope he doesn't take offense, but he's really the Nick Clegg of the left. In his arguments, and as the CPGB is really the classic libertarian approach to free speech. Now look, of course, capitalist ideology makes a great play about freedom of speech, but what they mean is not our free speech, but their free speech, and they continually try to encroach on our rights to free speech. For example, it's illegal now to support Hezbollah and Hamas because they're terrorist organizations, and supporting terrorist organizations has been made a criminal offense. I mean, most people won't necessarily get prosecuted, but if they're so minded, they can do that. Now, I think, and I have a very considerable experience of fighting fascism. I was secretary of the Anti-Nazi League in Brighton in the late 70s and early 80s when the fascists were a considerable force. I was on the executive of Anti-Fascist Action, and I've participated in many actions, both being beaten up and doing some beating up. So I know what the score is in that respect. And my first book was about the history of fighting fascism in Brighton. I have to say this: fascism is a deadly enemy to the working class and socialist movement, and that's how it should be treated. And you grant absolutely no rights to the fascists except their right to dissolve and go away. As Trotsky said, I mean, one of the best ways of educating them is by acquainting their heads with the pavement. and I stand by that. Fascism, I mean, Tina puts forward this classical liberal argument of we can defeat their ideas by superior ideas. Well, yes, but this is not a university seminar. It's not a debate. I mean, there are times, few and far between, when you can meet fascists on an equal terrain and you can discuss and debate. And I've done that. You know, I mean, I've debated and discussed with some of the leaders of the fascist movement, but they are few and far between. How fascism grows is by making itself felt on the streets and appearing to have a strength that will attract those who are often disorganized, a kind of plebeian masses. It doesn't operate on the basis of rationality because it operates in a system that is itself irrational. And that's why if what Tina says is correct, we could overthrow capitalism by arguing about how irrational it is. But of course we can't, because there are powerful factors and forces and material interests which lie behind it. And that's why the argument about free speech is essentially an un-Marxist one, because it operates on the basis that fascism is somehow rational and you can defeat it. It isn't. It's scapegoatism. When people are unemployed and suffering, and then you present an easy scapegoat in the form of the migrant, in the form of, as in Germany, of the Jew or whoever, that's powerful, and that will overcome any economic or political argument you have. The only thing the fascists understand is strength on the streets at the end of the day, because you have to make the fascists seem weak. And when they're weak, people aren't attracted to them. I've seen that. I mean, I've seen that in Brighton and elsewhere, where when we had a big presence and we overwhelmed them and they had to seek police protection against having their heads kicked in, then people were not attracted to them. They saw that we were the ones who were in the lead. It wasn't a question of rational argument. Of course you can have rational arguments with your own members, with working class kids who joined us, to say why it isn't a question of solving unemployment by barring immigration or sending people back, because it's very easy to defeat those arguments. But when the fascists are strong, their arguments, you blame the Jew, you blame the black person, etc., has a resonance, almost a material weight that you cannot combat. And that is the point. I mean, the mistake, of course, in Germany was that the communists and the socialists didn't get together to utterly defeat them. And quite honestly, freedom of speech and the idea of giving them any platform is inherently a very disastrous tactic. That's not to say that free speech and the no platform policy is a tactic. And there are occasions, like with Nick Griffin, when if he's outnumbered on a panel, then yes, debate him. I mean, I don't have the absolutist approach of the SWP either, which is no platform in all circumstances. You have to use your head and your brain, and you have to understand what it is that's motivating these people. There are times when, of course, you can stand up in an Oxford Union debate and out-debate them without any problem. I've got no problem with that. But you have to remember, fascism is a particular political phenomena, just like settler colonialism is. It's not simply bourgeois politics. It's counter-revolutionary. It operates on the basis of atomizing the working class and attracting the plebeian lumpen proletariat elements who have no political allegiances and can go either way. And what attracts them is strength. We have to be strong. And our strength means no platform, no freedom of speech, no right to dehumanize the other person. Okay, I think I've made my point. Thank you.
I want to ask you a question though, because it's an interesting discussion, isn't it? Is fascism the same amount of danger if the ruling class doesn't actually turn on it? I mean, in Germany, the capitalist class couldn't rule Germany anymore because the working class was so strong. Similarly in Italy, so they turned to the fascists and helped them grow and put them in charge. Without that need, of actually smashing a strong working class movement, because our movement at the moment is not very strong. Are the fascists the same, the kind of threat that needs to have mainly been met with sticks and stones? Is this the period?
Again, I think it depends. I mean, I don't think we have in Europe, with some exceptions, like in Golden Dawn in Greece, for example, truly fascist movements. I think we have far-right authoritarian movements, and we have to adapt our tactics accordingly. I don't even see Le Pen in France as a classic fascist. They operate in a different way. But fascism itself is not a product of bourgeois politics. It is autonomous in its own right, and it grew up autonomously. We know how it came from the Freikorps and the whole motley collection of far-right organizations in Germany that took umbrage at, for instance, the emancipation of Jews in 1871 and so on. So, I mean, but fascism itself is a movement that has its own roots, at which the bourgeoisie will give support when they see that it's actually attained a certain strength. And one of the things is you have to keep them small from the start, because then the bourgeoisie will see nothing to be gained by giving them support. Once fascism grows stronger, it's much more difficult, and then you're fighting for your own freedom of speech. Fascists, of course, hate any freedoms, including freedom of speech. So you have to be flexible. You know, I mean, we criticize the SWP, quite rightly so, for its popular frontism, but I actually think it got it right over the Anti-Nazi League in 1977. It's the only time they did get it right, incidentally. They actually did create a popular movement, and they actually couldn't control it. Rock Against Racism spun out of control, and so on. That was a genuine popular movement, which in a sense defeated the National Front, which was becoming strong. I mean, they were getting 30% in the local elections in places like Leicester. They were no joke, you know, and it meant that, you know, I mean, left bookshops were being firebombed and so on. But we must take fascism seriously. If we allow it to grow, we'll find it much more difficult to combat. And of course, there will be people, Kevin, on these demonstrations who are not fascists. And they will be attracted to the fascists because they see them doing something, you see them being strong. So even their periphery also will have to be attacked as well. But you have to have the numbers, of course. But it's important that you do get those numbers, because you can't implement no platform from a weak position. But never allow them to be strong. And control of the streets is fundamental to the growth of fascism.
Thanks, Tony. We only have two people with their hands up, so I actually suggest to bring in Kevin and Matthew now if they want to reply to that. Thank you, Tony.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think in terms of what Tony's just said, I mean, I think the thing is what you're seeing, of course, I mean, obviously, when he's right in terms of you're not seeing, even with Le Pen or in fact Meloni, who is of course now Prime Minister of Italy, which is extraordinary. And in fact, you've got somebody who's actually in an organization which is a direct political descendant of Mussolini, the Brothers of Italy, Fratelli d'Italia, as the Prime Minister of Italy. And the party which got the biggest vote, that isn't, you know, in terms, it's not a street fascist party. Although it's recently in Florence, of course, its youth movement did start trying to attack people, particularly school kids, and provoked the response. Actually was interesting because this was outside one of the schools, and the head of the neighbouring school called for a response based. She quoted Gramsci, I mean, which is extraordinary for a headmaster in an Italian school to quote Gramsci and say, you know, we need to stop this. And if a demonstration, 50,000 people turned out against the fascists, because I mean, obviously people understand this question. Yeah, they can't allow these people. The problem is that, I mean, if you look at what's happening in the US, I mean, the thing is, you are now seeing in the US very heavily armed fascist groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and the 3%ers. These people, you know, they made a serious effort to overturn the government on the 6th of January 2021. I mean, it's not, you know, it wasn't messing around. You know, they actually stockpiled guns. I mean, you know, at a hotel full of weapons and ammunition outside of Washington. They were intent on actually overturning the government in the US with the support of Trump and with the support of a chunk of the state. Now, clearly, a section of the ruling class is holding the fascists in reserve, you know, as it were. Classically, of course, Trump actually openly said this to the Proud Boys. He said, "Well, stand back and stand by till I want you." You know, so he then called them into action on the 6th of January 2021. This is a serious danger. particularly obviously in the US, you know, but elsewhere as well, fascism will be used. So I mean, I have to be very well aware, particularly with, as I say, the depth of the crisis that we're now seeing. You know, there's no obvious way out for the ruling class. You know, and so, you know, as Trotsky always said, you know, fascism is the last card, you know, the one they play at the end. But they're ready to play it. They will play it if they have to. And so we have to be ready to the counter.
Kevin.
Yeah, I'm not sure Nick Clegg would have had the same political trajectory as me. I was a student in Leicester between 1973 and 1976, and I was also Matthew at Lewisham, so we get the battle honours out of the way early on, I think. And I think the example of what happened in Leicester, or what happened in many towns in the 1970s, is quite instructive, because the point was that the attempt to weaken any NF base was carried out politically, but there was also defence, you know, and we did defend meetings, and we did, you know, protect areas that were coming under attack. But we also were aware that in many of the areas where the NF were getting between 25 and a 30% vote in the council elections, that no amount of screaming fascist and Nazi was going to do it. And you had to launch a political campaign. You had to actually go around the doors, and you actually had to say to people that blaming immigrants or blaming anybody else. So we were no platforming fascist ideas, and we were also, you know, physically defending ourselves and, you know, other people. And again, you know, I took part in that, like lots of other people. Even, I might add, one or two people who are now quite respectable Labour MPs, but that's another story. So what you know, to go back to the point I made originally, I'm not arguing for some sort of Gandhian, you know, pacifism. And I'm certainly, you know, the criticisms that Tony makes of the workers' movement in Europe between the wars are very well taken. But those mistakes were often political. They were political mistakes, both in terms of misunderstanding the nature of fascism, but also they were, I think, quite sort of fundamental misunderstandings about how to combat fascism. And I would say much of the current anti-fascist rhetoric is also a misunderstanding. Much of it is framed in liberal terms. Much of it, in, you know, the mainstream anti-racist groups will take that particular line. And I know that both Matthew and, you know, Tony won't take that line, but I think there is a danger in elevating fascism into some menace that is, for example, distinct from capitalism and is not linked to another type of political alternative, that you then make it some sort of evil that is actually devoid of context. And that then fits into the sort of official narrative. If you remember, I will bring in Gary Lineker. I know we've strayed a little far from him, but Lineker, in one of his tweets, argued that the Tories were betraying the sort of British tradition of Winston Churchill and of defending freedom. Now, that's not the sort of anti-fascism or anti-racism that I'm in favor of. And one of the dangers, I think, of elevating fascism in the way that we have done is to take it outside of the political and the class context, and particularly to link it to what, you know, capitalists and what capitalism does. Now, as for the liberal position, well, it's the position of Karl Marx, it's the position of the Labour movement, and it was an established position to defend freedom of political expression. And, you know, Tony's right, the ruling class attempts to undermine that all the time. So we have to defend that. It's a vital necessity, you know, free expression of ideas. Now, if, for example, the fascists were a mass movement, if, for example, this was 1920s Germany, then we would have to, you know, develop defensive tactics. We would have to look and how we would protect ourselves, we would have to look at our political campaigning. But at this stage, I think that we have to focus on the politics. And I again say that from experience, and I say it from the experience of, recent events in Merseyside, that we need to undermine the political basis of those groups. Physical defense is important, but politics are much more important than that.
Thank you, Kevin. Unfortunately, the left is not in a fit state at the moment to fight this politically, which is, of course, part of the problem and why we're doing these sessions to help rebuild the left on a more democratic basis. Cheryl, please, you've had your hand up.
Hi, everybody. This is a question that I would ask Tony if he's still listening. I'm sure he is, but actually, Suella Braverman's comments, Gary Lineker said that they were reminiscent of 1930s Germany, and I just wonder what Tony would think about that. And also, I don't really know how you describe somebody who was fascist, but in sort of tweeting over the last weekend, I did get a barrage of quite right-wing sort of people commenting in relation to what, that whole debate, that whole topic. And is it not important to engage? Well, first of all, I think it shows how pernicious that sort of right-wing ideology is, and how some Braverman's comments whips up a sort of fear about people, the other, coming over, taking our jobs, taking our houses. These were the sort of comments that I was getting. But isn't it important to kind of counter those arguments? Because it seems like she must know what she's doing, that the Tory party must know that it's that it's a dying party. It's on its way out anyway, not going to win the next election. And this is all about sort of appealing to people's fear, scapegoating, immigrants. And it is actually very dangerous, because I know colleagues who, I'm a housing lawyer, I've got colleagues who are immigration lawyers who were getting real nasty sort of comments after Braverman's speech, which also sort of attacked left-wing lawyers and the lefty blob and all the rest of it that she goes on about. But isn't it important to sort of be able to counter those very basic arguments about, immigrants are coming, they get welfare. The gist of what people seem to be suggesting is they're getting something, they're getting hotels paid, they're getting this, they're getting that. And that must be so attractive to people in a time when, there's working class people are really struggling because of cost of living crisis. Yeah, so that's just
Thanks,
one of
Cheryl.
the,
Bring in Steve, and then Tony can have a second bite of the cherry.
Thanks, comrades. There are so many issues. Here, it's difficult to kind of find your way around them. But I agree with Tina's opening statement, basically, which says that even though Gary Lineker might be a millionaire or whatever he is, as tribunes of the people, we would defend him if he's being oppressed or badly treated, no matter what class. I mean, that was Lenin's basic point. We as tribune of the people, the party would defend anybody being oppressed or badly treated, whatever class they come from. But I do think there's some class issues and class questions here. Obviously, one of the things is there a danger of fascism in the present situation or not? Because in a way, you might think that Gary Lineker's a bit like the canary in the coal mine. You know what I mean? He said he could smell fascism, and he was warning of it. And he said the language. He didn't say this with a fascist country, we got a fascist, the Tories a fascist government. He said it's the language of the 1930s. If you substituted the word Jews for asylum seekers, then you'd be in a very similar position with the kind of dehumanizing language that was being used. So I think we'd definitely be in solidarity with Gary Lineker, and I think he was attacked for his terrible language by saying that he thought the language was like the 1930s, and I think he's got some evidence that that's the case. The way this country is going is heading in that direction. There's not a mass fascist party, obviously, but there's a big danger in the present situation. I also think, just a slight different tack, I always think England is a football team. It's not a nation. You know, we don't really have a nation. We have this football team. And obviously, therefore, if you want to find out what kind of nation we are, then let's go look at the football team. You know, all that thing about taking the knee was a very important cultural event. And in that sense, that match of the day with Lineker and Ian Wright and Alan Shearer, that comes and immediately an attack on one of them becomes a sort of thing that engages the whole nation. The whole people get immediately interested in this kind of subject. That's why the ruling class or the people in charge decided they better put it to bed, because it was opening up something they didn't want to see, especially when we had the first wildcat strike. I mean, I don't remember when people walked out of their job and refused to do the job they were meant to do. There was no ballot, was there? They just said, right, we're not doing anymore. It was fantastic, wasn't it? A wildcat strike, fantastic solidarity, and the BBC leadership had to cave in. So we should be celebrating wildcat strikes of that type. No, you know, they didn't take any notice of the anti-union laws. So we should definitely do that. And of course, there are contractual issues. We talk about free speech. It's the rights of the employee, the employer, the BBC, to dictate what a worker can say when they're not at work, not acting on the official business of the employer. Gary Lineker wasn't making these views on Match of the Day, was he? He was in his private capacity tweeting something. So does that mean that workers don't have any right to say anything if they're not at work even? I think that's a very important issue. Contracts do control, you know, contracts are a mechanism by which employers control their workers, and they don't want us to say anything outside our employment contract. And that's why we've got whistleblowing and commercial secrecy and all those other things you have to sign up for. And I think as Democrats, we should say, oh, that's wrong. You know, you should not only have a right to free speech when you're not at work, you should have a right to free speech when you're at work, if we want to talk about that. Why are the contracts the way that they are? And then I will more or less come to the point, just the last point, okay, which was this. We say, well, what do we want to say? I think we should be in favour of a democratic BBC. That is to say, we want a board elected by and sovereign to the journalists, the researchers, the programme producers, the cleaners, the porters, and everybody else who works for the BBC. They should be able to elect the board that oversees how the BBC operates. And that means that we need a constitution we need laws to embed those rights. And of course, that's not going to happen if we don't have some sort of democratic revolution, without some sort of Republican constitution that we actually need. That's got to be a change in the way things work. And we've got to make democracy and free speech absolutely central to our laws and our constitution. And unless the left takes that up and merely sees the danger of fascism, which is right for Tony to say that, and I just defend Kevin by saying he didn't say we shouldn't defend ourselves against fascism. He said we should by physical force. But, you know, that's obviously a real serious danger. And I agree with that. It's a danger in the situation. But if we don't present an answer to the problem and how we want to see things run in England, which is only a football team and not a nation, then we're in a bit of a state. So there we go. I'll finish there.
Okay, Steve. Football team. Not sure what to think about that, but thank you. Tony, to quickly reply to the comrade, and then we're going to move on to the panelists to sum up, because we actually have to finish this meeting fairly soon.
Yes, of course. Firstly, Cruella Braverman and Sunak know exactly what they're doing. They want to win the next election if possible, and they don't mind employing racism as a tactic in order to do that, with all the tropes and stereotypes and mystification that go with that. The question really is what we do. I agree with Steve, ironically enough. We had a great victory with Gary Lineker. The BBC was forced onto the defensive in terms of their impartiality rules, because they couldn't answer the question, for example, why Lineker was allowed to attack Qatar's human rights policy on TV, but he wasn't allowed to attack his own government's human rights policy. So, I mean, they were shown up to be total and utter hypocrites. And I also agree, of course, about BBC workers, though I suspect Lineker isn't a worker, but he has a personal contract with them, the same for most of the presenters. But I think, for example, of Stan Keeble, who was dismissed because he dared to speak about Nazi Zionist collaboration. And the BBC, of course, fitted him up in that. It was one of their journalists who recorded him. So, yes, it's utter hypocrisy. The Tories go on about freedom of speech on campus. On the other hand, they seek the dismissal of David Miller, for example. So we know what it's about, but it's interesting. And it's covered in my book, Zionism During the Holocaust, about comparing with the Nazis. I mean, firstly, Lineker talked about the 30s, and immediately Yvette Cooper and Lady Nugent, Emily Thornberry to you and me, went on about, oh, you can't compare with Hitler, pure evil, the Holocaust, that's unique. But of course, in the 30s, there was no Holocaust. That was in the 40s. So even historically, they are wrong. But yes, I mean, in the 30s, they demonized Jews primarily, but not only Jews, and they treated them as the other. They put them outside the boundaries of normal society. And that's exactly what Braverman is doing with refugees. They are illegal. They're outlaws. They're not part of us. And so we have to absolutely combat them. Now, of course, I don't think we can do it simply with rational arguments, because it is, in essence, irrational. I mean, just think about it. They're taking our jobs, as if jobs are a fixed quota in any society. If that's the case, then if you expel all brown-eyed people, presumably you will create more reduced unemployment. I mean, it's a nonsense economically. But, you know, I mean, people don't think of it in those terms. I mean, that was the same with Brexit, in essence, that we would create more jobs, but we've done nothing of the sort. We've gone in the opposite direction, if anything. So fascism basically is irrational. Like, it feeds off the irrationality of this society, and that's why you can't simply deal with it through free speech. But as regards, say, the particular aspect of this, which was the Holocaust, we should say, yes, there are many, many comparisons that can be made, not only between what Germany did and what Israel did, but also what we do. Hitler didn't come out of the blue. He fed on existing ideas, the eugenicist ideas in the United States, where, I mean, he admired what the individual states had done in forcibly sterilizing people who were held to be of a feeble mind. Yes, I will wind up, but all I'm just saying is really that fascism, and the Nazis in particular, were the product of a particular society. They're not unique. They're not divorced from their roots. So we have to tackle it really on all levels. But it's not enough to be defensive against the fascists. We have to also go on the attack. It's by going on the attack that you keep them weak. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Okay, now back to the panelists to sum up, and I'm going to take in Kevin first because he has to leave very soon. Quite a few issues brought up in the discussion and the ensuing debate. But your final thoughts on these issues, please, Kevin.
Yeah, I'd like to thank people who've asked questions and made comments. There's some on the sort of chat box there, which I'm never really able to keep up with, but there did look to be some interesting ideas coming forward. I'd like to start with Tony's last point, because I think it's quite accurate and actually quite important that reactionary ideas are not just the preserve of a small band of sort of lunatics, and they're not also the preserve of a group of people called fascists. in the societies that I'm aware of where mass fascist movements developed, and the Nazis are a good example of that, they derived a lot of strength from existing reactionary ideas from all sides of the political spectrum. And often in making Nazism and that period seem unique, it actually then mystifies it considerably. Indeed, it takes it almost into a sort of moral tale. There is a sort of argument that that by exceptionalizing this movement, that you place it beyond analysis, and the use of the phrase evil. I've got a number of books actually which discuss the nature of evil. And what I think is interesting is not only can they not agree on the nature of the term, I mean, they're theological primarily, but it's often used as a way of hiding analysis. You just call something evil, or indeed you sometimes call something fascist, and that means that you then can't start to analyze it. And I would certainly agree that the Tories are using language which does all of the functions that both Tony and I think Cheryl drew attention to, which was to look for scapegoats. And those scapegoats are not only people who migrate into the country, but they're also found within the country, lefty lawyers, university academics, do-gooders, soft church leaders. In fact, you start running through a whole category of it, and it does start to sound a bit like Pastor Niemöller's classifications. So I think the Lineker case, which is easy to dismiss as a little bit of a storm in the teacup, I was partly listening to Gary Lineker earlier this evening on the FA quarter-final, which City have won quite convincingly. So, Lineker's back in his chair, all's right with the world. And of course, it is easy just to portray it in that way, but I think it does have a significance. It does raise this question of freedom of speech outside of the workplace. Steve was quite right in that, and Tony's quite right to draw attention to Stan Keeble, who was fitted up by a BBC journalist who wasn't acting to defend free speech, but was attempting to control thought and to clamp down on discussion and debate in that way. I think I've made my own position clear on fascism, and I think the no platforming argument is one that often is used as an excuse not to analyze the nature of fascism, or indeed to throw up a political alternative to it, or indeed to lump together wide sections of the population who may have reactionary and xenophobic ideas, but I think will need to be won over. We're going to need to have the support of an overwhelming majority of the working class, and that does require establishing a political alternative, a mass Marxist party that can do that, that can, provide an alternative hegemonic view of the world, a counter view of the world to that of the bourgeoisie. And if we can't establish that, then our socialist project has no chance of getting off the ground. So from quite a small debate about one particular football presenter, I think we've gone into much wider areas. I'm sure the discussion will continue. Tony and I and other comrades, Matthew, we've discussed these issues before, and I dare say we will come back again. And yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Kevin. It's a very interesting discussion as well. And I've only just read that Gary Lineker was never booked in his entire professional career, the most vanilla football player probably on the planet, and he caused these waves, quite something. Over to you, Matthew.
Well, the thing is also, of course, I mean, in the days when he played, of course, you could get away with a lot more. You could actually hack people down. I mean, I do remember one occasion in which a player in Scotland actually managed to break somebody's leg without even a foul being awarded.
All these woke referees ruining football now, aren't they?
Well, no, they just changed the rules. I mean, it means that the players are more protected from some of the more savage efforts to damage them. You know, so you can be sent off now for things that wouldn't attract much of a penalty previously. So yeah, football in those terms has changed. But the thing is, I mean, I think that it's been a useful discussion. I mean, I think that, you know, the thing is obviously to what comes out. I mean, I think first of all is obviously the state of play at the moment. I mean, you know, that we've got a position of social and economic crisis, which is what's driving all this stuff, and it's only going to get worse. I mean, the fun thing, and unfortunately, we don't seem to have any real any comedians with a real economic understanding, because of course the really funny joke is Jerome Powell seeking to jack up interest rates at a rate unknown before in history, in an effort, obviously, as he said himself, to basically squash these uppity workers, and instead blowing a hole in his own banking system. You know, and this is not resolved. So I mean, I was hoping somebody would say some funny stuff about that at some point, but obviously we don't have the kind of comedians. But what we do have, of course, is a move to the far, say the whole political spectrum, basically, of bourgeois politics. You know, and you can include all the normal parties in this. You know, the Tories, Labour Party, the PS in, you know, remnants of the PS in France, you know, the Macron, everything that happens in Italy, you know, what's going on in Germany, you know, in terms of the rise of the alternative of Deutschland, is moving to, is actually situated, the debate now is situated on the far right, you know. There's no you know, left. Nobody's putting forward any sort of left alternative at this point, or has got the platform to do so. So I mean, you know, we can see. I mean, this government obviously employing racism, I mean, nakedly so, and other, you know, far right methods, and as I say, importing stuff from the Republicans wholesale. And that whole thing. The whole question of the US bears watching, because obviously, as the imperial hegemon, it sets the tone for the rest of the world, and you know, therefore should be watched most closely. That, you know, we have a situation where the Labour Party is attacking the government from the right. You know, some people are attacking the Labour Party from the right. Sorry, attacking the Tories from the right, and saying, well, okay, you know, well, obviously you're not good enough at racism. You can't throw enough people out of the country. It's effectively their line, you know, and what, as I say, what Lineker draws out, of course, is that the bulk of people in this country don't agree with that, but there's no political expression for that at all. And the question is, well, you know, the left needs to get its act together. I think that, you know, in terms of what was, you know, the issue of the 30s, of course, is that racism and all these other methods are not exclusive to fascists. You know, all of this stuff is there. All of this stuff, you can draw parallels, no problem. It doesn't mean they're fascist. It just means that, you know, they're racist and disgusting, you know, and discriminatory and sexist and all the rest of it. You know, that's, you know, we can say, well, you have filthy politics. It doesn't make them fascist. We have to be absolutely clear as to what a fascist is, you know, because obviously we'll need to, it's something we need to combat. And the problem being, of course, is that fascist is used as an insult. Basically, oh, I don't like so-and-so, you must be a fascist. You know, which is not true, and you know, really, if you're going to use political terms, you have to define them. Particularly something as dangerous as fascism. You know, we have to be very clear what it is and what it isn't. So, you know, because there are certain features of it, and there's certain things to combat it, which, as I think we've gone through, you know, applies to it alone, not to any other form of politics. So in those terms, you know, useful, but I mean, I think, you know, I think the thing that comes out, as I say, is the desperate need for the left to get its act together. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you, Matthew. And that's, of course, what we're trying to help achieve with these series of events and the Why Marx series, which we are co-organizing and which happens every Thursday. I hope comrades will join us this Thursday when we're starting to look at a three-parter on Marx and democracy. And as always, there's lots of time for questions and debate. And the LLA also wants to look at other issues, including China and Israel in the near future, because there are big developments in both countries. Obviously, the drive to war is a huge one in terms of China and what's going on there. I'm also told to not be so mean about Gary Lineker, because he wasn't dirty, which is fair enough. That is a good way to not be dirty. So all good for you for being you've never been booked. Okay, comrades, thank you very much for joining us. So that was a really good discussion, and hope to see many of you soon. Bye-bye.